All right, we are now live for the first philosophy pop-up for December 2018. And as I am slowly getting myself unburied from lots and lots and lots of grading and dealing with student issues for the 5 classes I've been teaching this semester, I thought that a good topic, since it's top of mind for me, is student success. And when I talk about student success, I don't just think about, well, what makes students successful, but also the things that stand in the way of students being successful. So, obstacles to students experiencing success, or having success, or continuing to have success for that matter. And then, various issues that tend to arise. I'm not the kind of person who tends to complain a lot about students, with this sort of generational thing that I see quite a few instructors doing, talking about, new generations as having less capacities than earlier ones. Because I think back to my college days, and there were plenty of my peers who, as students were kind of slouches, were not doing a good job. And I would look at them and be like, what's wrong with your approach to this sort of stuff? Why do you want everything made easier, dumbed down, or why can't you just study the material? And I don't think that there's a greater proportion of students today who are not as well prepared. I think, at least from my experience, there were just as many back then. And when I say prepared, I don't just mean in terms of like academic or cognitive, things. I'm talking about behavioral things, right? Assumptions that are made, or ways that people do things, and how they, how they work at stuff, how they plan their day, how they manage time, all of those sorts of issues. But I think that there are some new challenges. I would say that the availability of the internet probably raises the stakes for people who don't have very good time management capacities. And maybe also on the professors' sides, right? Because there's professors have a lot more work that they have to do with committees and assessment and things like that. And maybe the stakes are raised a little bit for how they should prepare their class in terms of using the course management system and having assignments posted ahead of time. So I don't think that we're in a radically new situation. For millennial students, or the generation that's coming up now after the millennials. As a matter of fact, I will say this, that I teach a lot of professional students who are older. They're people who have been working for a while, and I see the same sort of mistakes being made, and not accessing the course materials until the last minute, and excuses, and expectations of getting some sort of points for effort. I see that the same from 40 somethings as I do from 20 somethings or teenagers. I don't think it's a radically new issue that we're facing. Looks like there's some questions here already being posed, but looks like some of them are a little less relevant than others. I'm actually going to take this one from Kanagelvi, and then I'll jump back into talking about student success. So they observe, I think a lot of students miss out on some educational tools older people got, like shorthand or certain memory techniques. I would even put Greek and Latin in that same category. So I know I didn't learn shorthand. And there are some things that are not being taught as often that were taught, like writing in cursive, for example. But I don't know that that makes a big difference. Now, memory techniques, I think that depended totally on who was teaching you and where you were going to school. We didn't really learn much of that in my K through 12 or undergraduate education, and what memory techniques we used in graduate school, we really kind of had to learn on our own. Greek and Latin, we are many generations here in the United States past times when you could expect that somebody would have Greek or Latin in their K through 12 or college education. I think most people are lucky if they're learning one foreign language, and oftentimes you're restricted to just Spanish. Latin, French, German, those have pretty much fallen by the wayside. So I don't know that that's really the case in any sort of broad comparative way. Maybe it's more like that in Europe, that there's been a decline in that. But I think that you are right, though. A lot of students miss out on educational tools, but nowadays we have so many more educational tools available to us if we want to use them. And the internet has just vastly opened up capacities for that, and in several different ways. One is, if I'm teaching a class, every college class that I teach, I have a course management system, and it could be Blackboard or Moodle or Sakai or D2L or Canvas. I've used even a few other more obscure ones, but they all have the same basic capacities, right? You can create modules with lesson pages, upload files, have the readings available, shoot videos if you want that you can upload or at least link to from YouTube, podcasts. You can, aggregate links for the students. And good teachers, they actually do that. And they create quizzes online that you can use to check your knowledge. And they create learning opportunities like discussion forums. And I do that. That's why for me it's pretty easy to transition from face-to-face to online teaching, because every one of my face-to-face classes is halfway online, right? Now, a lot of teachers don't do that. And so if you're a student and your teacher hasn't given you the resources, then you have to look online yourself. And I guess for some topics and some thinkers, there's not a lot available, right? In philosophy, for example, there's lots of stuff available, say on Descartes, although a lot of it's not particularly good. But maybe there's not much available on more obscure philosophers like Shestov, right? So you have to kind of look around, but maybe you don't look for videos. Maybe you look for podcasts. Maybe you look for encyclopedia entries. Maybe you look for other resources. But the point is, you can find a lot of stuff out there to help you, and in other fields as well. It does require some of what we call information literacy, and that's something important to teach as well. How do you tell the good sources from the sources that are not so good? How do you do that, especially as somebody who's not an expert and doesn't quite know what they're getting into? Those are good questions. But if you have access to the internet, you actually have access to all sorts of resources. And I think it's up to students to take an active role in their own learning and not be very passive and expect the instructor to provide all the resources. That said, you shouldn't be like in my classes. If I give you Plato to read, I don't want you using SparkNotes as a substitute for actually reading the Plato, because then I should have just given you the SparkNotes to begin with and said, well, we're not going to really read philosophy here. We're just going to read some summaries of it written by some people who read philosophy. That's not the way I do things. But that's because I consider my students capable of actually reading philosophy, right? Wherever they happen to be. So, all right, let's go back and look at some of these other questions. Made of Clay, I'm 21. I'm about to start college just now, and I'm going for philosophy. though there's that thought in the back of my head that it's useless, even though I really love it, can you encourage me? But it's not useless. People with philosophy degrees work in all sorts of fields. There's some things that are sort of a natural spin-off. If you're planning on going to law school and you're going to take the LSAT, being a philosophy major, great way to have a high LSAT score because you're working with arguments all the time. But there's all sorts of other areas. It's just that you just can't expect that because you've got a diploma, somebody's automatically going to hire you. You have to develop certain skills and certain capacities. And you have to be able to make the case for why the things that you've been studying in philosophy actually connect up with real life issues and problems, and how you can be, if you want people to hire you, you've got to make some sort of case for why you're bringing value to them. I think that's perfectly reasonable for them to ask that, but it's feasible to do. There's plenty of success stories out there that you can look at of people who have taken philosophy degrees and done quite well, and are still applying philosophy in the course of their lives or their careers. So hopefully that provides you with some encouragement. Abdullah asked, does studying philosophy require a lot of memorization? I don't think it does. But different students have different approaches. Some students love to memorize things. I'm the kind of person who was very uninterested, even when I was learning languages, in just memorization. I wanted to understand why things worked the way they did, and then derive what ought to be the case from that. Learning the larger system or the bigger picture, as we say. But if you're the kind of person who likes to memorize things and that's your approach, then maybe you'll do that. I mean, I think you can learn about the history of philosophy best in some ways by just reading a lot in the history of philosophy, reading the actual source texts, and then what Plato thought about something or what Descartes thought about something, and you could memorize it, I guess, if you want to. But if you work at it enough, you don't have to memorize it. You develop a sort of affinity or a connaturality with it. It becomes part of you, right? It becomes part of your mind. And then that sticks with you probably better than stuff that you just memorize. Andrew asks, is there any way to be sure of not misinterpreting philosophers, excluding secondary literature and stuff alike? Probably not. You're probably going to misinterpret, when you're first studying a given text, especially if you haven't been studying philosophy that long, you're probably going to misinterpret some things, right? And some of it will just be at a lexical level. We were talking yesterday, a friend of mine and I, about the issue of false cognates, right? When you're reading a text and there's a term and we use that term one way and it was used a different way back then, it means something different. That's something you have to be attentive to, and you might screw things up by not knowing that, and that's okay. I mean, it's not as if you have to be perfect in your understanding of philosophy at every moment, especially when you're starting out at a beginner intermediate level. It's not even as if I have to, as an expert, know everything and be completely right about everything. That's not a requirement in order to do philosophy well. Most of philosophy is kind of an iterative process. You study something and try to apply it and ask other people about it and realize you got some of it wrong, and then go back to it and get a little bit more right and a little bit more right and a little bit more right. And that's okay. Let's see here. Memento Mori. I'm a law student and I hate it as much as I love philosophy. That's very unfortunate. I would love to join a master's program in philosophy, but my GPA is bad, but I keep publishing philosophy articles. I would say finish the law degree. It's always nice to have a law degree. You can do things with it. It's not as if you have to get all your degrees out of the way as a young person right away. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some master's programs, a low GPA could be a real problem, but oftentimes you can write an essay that explains your particular case and say, "Oh, I'd like an exception to be made. I've done this, I've done that. Here's why my case, even though I've got a low GPA, here's why you should consider me." I imagine that the GRE is still for American programs at least, considered quite important. Um, but I mean, the cool thing is that I've pointed this out in the past before. We don't have a unified system. We have like a patchwork of all these different universities and programs, and there's some generalizations you can make, but they differ from each other considerably, right? So you could, you could find one that's well suited to what you want to study and that will let you in and let you do what you want to do. Um, all right, Tom 8 has a question that I'm not going to have a very interesting answer for. You said once in an AMA that you've tried the drug ecstasy. Has that experience changed your perspective on the world in any way? Can you tell us about that experience? No, because it didn't really do anything for me. I was, this is back in the 90s, and I was drinking, and we were having a good time. And I only, I did that once and didn't really pay that much attention to it. So certainly didn't change my life in any important way. I don't think. Here's what I have to say. I get a lot of questions about various drugs and stuff like that. There are people who think that by taking drugs, you like open your mind, or do things that allow you to connect with the cosmos or reality better. And maybe that's true to some extent, but if that's the case, then they're a crutch, a chemical crutch, and you can do that with other things as well. And it wouldn't be better just to like cultivate your mind to the point where you could do that sort of thing. I mean, you can say, well, ecstasy will allow you to be closer with other people and to put up with their bullshit better. Yeah, so will virtue ethics, if you practice it. So I'm not I've had some friends who are really big into taking different things and experimenting with them, but I never found that very, very interesting. Memento has a follow-up. What would you advise me to do to increase my chances of getting admitted and even finding some scholarship for school fees after I graduate? Well, like I said, if we're talking about the American context, I don't think that there's, a blueprint because the programs are very different from each other. I would say, think about the essay that you're going to write and submit about why you want to go there. And I would, if I were you and I wanted to go to a particular program, I'd start making contacts with them, writing some of the professors and, if possible, meeting some of them. Scholarships, that completely depends on the institution. Some places give you funding, other places don't have much funding, and it's up to them how they allocate it. So you'd want to ask somebody who's in that department how it works with that. But yeah, there's not much else that I think that you could say that's helpful in that. All right, Tiberio. I've read Turgenev's Father and Sons. Bazarov's character is a self-proclaimed nihilist. Even though the book takes place around 1850, I found the book very prophetic because I've seen a lot. Could you comment on that? This new self-proclaimed nihilist generation that chooses to deny everything in order not to respect it. Nihilist, by the way, is an equivocal term or polysemic term. It doesn't have just one single meaning. The Russian nihilists were not exactly the same thing as Nietzsche's diagnosing as nihilism, let alone what people are sometimes calling it today. So you always want to ask, when somebody says, I'm a nihilist, or I'm advocating nihilism, or I'm against nihilism, you got to say, well, what exactly do you mean by that? And the nihilists that were in Russia, most of whom were wiped out, by the way. So that's one reason they didn't continue to have a great effect on history. Um, they were committed to a kind of social progress, but without that kind of underpinning of the Enlightenment. And they were very much against the conventions that were deeply rooted in Russian society at the time, even as it's starting to unravel. It's a great book. I love Turgenev, and I really enjoy that particular book myself. I think Turgenev, in writing that, places himself up in the pantheon of great dialogic Russian writers like Dostoevsky, for example. Um, so that's I went through a period back when I was an undergraduate where I was reading my way through anything Russian I could get my hands on, because it turned out they had such cool writers. So I was reading a lot of Turgenev and Gogol and Pushkin and we read all of Solzhenitsyn stuff. That's much later. Read my way through Dostoevsky, and I really, I was having a good time with that. But that's a book that I particularly like, and I'd recommend it. It's well worth the read. If you haven't read Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, then you should check it out. Sebastian, how did you become a philosophy professor? What advice would you give someone looking for a career in academia or philosophy? I've got a whole video on advice about becoming a philosophy professor, and I'd say most of that I would still stand by today. It's a tough gig, and I'll give you sort of one little bit from that. Go to the highest tier school that you can afford, because the job market is really terrible, and it's going to continue to remain terrible for academics in general and for philosophy in particular. And whether we like it or not, or think that it's fair, people from top tier universities, even if they're not particularly good, often get the job over people from middle tier universities, even if they're really good. That's just the way the game works, and there's a lot of reasons for that we could go into. How did I become a philosophy professor? Well, that's kind of a funny story. I mean, I sort of stumbled into philosophy by chance and stuck with it, and then finished my undergraduate with a degree in philosophy and mathematics, and had to decide, what do I want to do? And even at that time, I still wasn't even thinking about, well, what am I going to do with a degree eventually? I just wanted to know, should I go to graduate school for philosophy because I really liked philosophy and wanted to study more? Should I go for mathematics, which I also very much liked? Or should I take the actuarial exams, a nice safe path, and have a reliable, very low stress job? And while I was making that decision, I was working here in Milwaukee, just blocks from where we currently live, in a building called the 100 East building, as a third shift security guard, and reading a lot of philosophy and working on my foreign languages. And I decided I would apply for graduate school in philosophy. And then I settled into Southern Illinois because they offered me the most money the quickest. And I liked it and just kept going with it. And then it got to the point where I had to start thinking about, what am I going to do after I get this degree? And philosophy professor was a viable option. I was already, publishing at the time. I was, doing pretty good teaching work and stuff like that, building up my vita. And I was fortunate in that I found a job. The first job was teaching in a maximum security prison. I did that for 6 years, and then I moved to Fayetteville State University, where I was a professor there, and then left to come up to New York to be with my then at that time fiance, now wife. And then I became part-time and started doing other things on the side. So my career trajectory is not one that I think a lot of people could imitate. And I don't know that it's particularly illustrative to talk about it, but that's okay. Joe asks, I'm third year university, having real trouble writing essays. I can fully understand content, but my writing, I think, lets me down. Any tips? Um, well, you could think about breaking the writing down into manageable chunks. Think about, sort of mapping it out. And I'm not talking about like a traditional outline, but more like an actual just map of things. You think about, well, what am I trying to get across in this essay? What are the criteria that I need to meet for my instructor who's requiring me to write it? What points do I need to make? And then you start working backwards from that and start thinking, okay, what can I do with the materials that I've got? How can I demonstrate the things that I need to demonstrate? And I would say, write your introduction and your conclusion last. Work on the content stuff. The introduction, that's the thing to finish at the end. Don't try to, write a big promissory note at the beginning that you might not be able to live up to, and then you feel bad about it. Just, write an introduction that summarizes what you actually did manage to pull off in the paper. That's the way to do it. And again, do it in manageable chunks. Sometimes people try to just sit down and write a paper in one sitting, and some people can pull that off, but others need to do it piece by piece by piece. And so that could be helpful. All right. Looks like we have a lot of questions and topics here. So, subconscious qualms. What notion of God do you find the most convincing? God as a being or God as being itself? Well, I guess I'm more traditionally Platonist in that way, sort of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, even, in some respects, some pagan Neoplatonists were like that. I think it makes more sense to talk about God as being than as a single being, an entity. So, Made of Clay, what are your thoughts on Rick Roderick? I think it's unfortunate he died pretty young, because I like his talks that he's given that we still have. It's fortunate that somebody recorded them. He seems like a pretty cool guy, but I forget how I think he died of a heart attack or something, and he wasn't that much older, I think, than I currently am now. So, all right, 1, 2, 3, duck. Does contemporary market society promote or erode virtue in your view? What readings or papers in this area would you recommend? So, two different things there. If we think about it in terms of like, let's let the market decide or anything along those lines, then I think that it erodes virtue. And that was the issue even back in ancient Greece. You see Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics talking quite a bit about this. Do we put up, moral conceptions just to a kind of popular vote, whether it's voting in the forum or voting in the marketplace? No, because that's not how we actually determine those things. And anybody who thinks that that's how you determine them, that's exactly the kind of person you want to keep out of that vote, because they don't understand those sorts of issues. And there's plenty of other aspects of market society that make things difficult. I mean, if you're having to work your butt off in crappy circumstances and eat crap from people all day long, it's going to be tougher for you to cultivate the virtues because you're starting out at a much tougher place than other people who are in a much more privileged position. But it doesn't make it impossible. Now, what readings or papers in this area would you recommend? I don't know. I mean, you could start with, stuff from Plato and Aristotle onward, go all the way through looking at political economy and sort of, Marxist analysis of that. And then, you could look at somebody like Alasdair MacIntyre, who effectively runs the whole gamut of that. And who is quite interested in those sorts of issues. And there's so many people out there who who has something to say about these matters. The one thing that I would say that I think could be quite helpful is when you're looking at older discussions and models, like think about Adam Smith, right, and the invisible hand. Adam Smith's invisible hand was not intended to apply to late capitalism as a justification for Amazon doing whatever the hell it wants, right? It was, it's a conception that has been greatly abused by many people to argue for all sorts of things that are sort of deleterious over time. Likewise, de Tocqueville, who I'm going to be recording a podcast on later on this week with a friend and colleague of mine. His notion about the small business person and voluntary or intermediate associations and learning how to manage things, that's not the modern corporation, nor is it even the modern educational institution. You have to do a lot of work to adapt these ideas from previous times to the present, and it's not impossible work, but it is work. You can't just suck up a thing here and just plop it right down over here and think that it's going to automatically connect up. That's how you generate ideology, right? A la Brick. Let's see. When we study Hegel's phenomenology of spirit to acquire full knowledge about the condition of Hegel's era and his personal life conflicts, I wouldn't study the phenomenology for that. I mean, Hegel doesn't mention hardly anything by name in the phenomenology. You have to do so many connecting things up. I mean, you want to know about Hegel's era and Hegel's life conflicts, read biographies of Hegel. That's probably going to be a hell of a lot more helpful than trying to tease it out of the phenomenology. You're just not going to, you're not going to tease it out of any of his works, I think, quite frankly. So yeah, I would look for biographies. Now, which is a good biography? I don't know. I haven't read any of that sort of stuff for years and years because I'm not that interested in the biography of Hegel. I'm more interested in unpacking the thought in his works. So, all right, philosopher Greg, nice name there. What is the cutting edge of philosophy today? I don't know. I don't think there is a cutting edge of philosophy today. That implies that there's like some sort of consensus about where progress is actually taking place, and the field the way we have it. You can't stay on top of even a fraction of the contemporary developments. You can only focus on a few areas. And there's a lot of, as there are in every era, there's a lot of sort of flash in the pan faddish people who are big now because people are buying their books or reading them and talking about them, who are just going to be footnotes 30, 40 years from now, and only antiquarians are going to be looking at their stuff. But it's tough to tell sometimes who's who, right? So yeah. All right. Joe Bowler has some stuff to la Brick about Hegel. Lon Laz, how do you reconcile your Christian worldview with the fact that Lemmy is God? Well, that's sort of a work in progress. I don't think Lemmy is God. I think Lemmy was an amazing musician, and I really I'm sad that he's gone. But we just sort of joke about that sort of thing. It's funny because I when I was young, if you were to ask me 18-year-old Greg, who's your favorite metal band, I would have said unhesitatingly Iron Maiden, right? Motorhead is probably on the same rank for me as Iron Maiden is. They're certainly in the top tier, along with Judas Priest and quite a few other bands who I keep going back to over and over again, going into their catalog. Yeah. All right. So Brave Jr., not a question. Just wanted to thank you for being you and helping me tremendously in my life. Very nice. I'm glad that the videos have been useful for you. I always like to know that they're having some positive effect. Otherwise, it's sort of like throwing messages into many bottles. Yeah. Let's see here. All right, there's some back and forth between Alan and Joe that I'm going to skip over. Sebastian, I very much enjoy many of the lecture series you've uploaded. I was wondering if you could do a series on Merleau-Ponty. So we're talking about Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist, studied with Husserl, taken by many of the early French readers before Husserl got translated, and they realized how different he was from Merleau-Ponty to be sort of a faithful transmitter of Husserl's ideas. But well worth reading in his own right, both for his, massive work, The Phenomenology of Perception, also for many of his essays, and even for his later work, The Visible and the Invisible. He's somebody I haven't read for quite a while. I used to be quite into Merleau-Ponty, in part because my mentor, Garth Gillen, was a Merleau-Ponty scholar. But he's somebody I'd like to go back to. I don't know if I'd enjoy him as much going back now. I remember really enjoying like the Phenomenology of Perception and the Structure of Comportment and some of these other works. And really the video production, the things that are driving it are what I need for my students for my classes, a lot of the core concept videos, what people have an interest in, the half-hour Hegel, the big commitment I made there that I'm trying to fulfill, and then what people are demanding. I do commissioned videos if you want to like speed things up, but it's always a matter of finding time. That can be quite tough. All right. John Platts, do I have an alternative way of supporting my work? I'm suspicious of Patreon. Do you think its censorship is politically motivated? Yeah, I think its censorship is politically motivated, but I don't care because everybody's politically motivated and nobody's pure in that respect. And, they're a business like anyone else. So Sargon of Akkad wants to violate the things that they decide to be the rules, and he gets stung. Tough, I actually lost a few patrons, Patreon supporters who are like, "Oh, you got rid of Sargon," and it's in the exit interview, and I'm like, "I didn't get rid of him. Patreon did. I don't know why you're taking it out on me." People can contribute through PayPal. PayPal's got its own political stuff. You're not going to find a platform that doesn't. That's all there is to really say about that. Do you know how I mostly support my work? With my business and my clients and, my teaching for academic institutions, because Patreon is nice, but it's not like I'm, setting the world on fire with it. So, you get what you get, right? It's not like we're going to get Patreon to change whatever biases they have. So you work with the imperfect world we have. Damon, how do I know if grad school in philosophy is right for me? Well, that's a good question. So think about whether you want to, in effect, put your financial life on hold for anywhere from 2 to 7 years and possibly go into debt, and balance that against what it is that you want to study intensively in graduate school, and what you think the degree at the end is going to provide you with, what opportunities. And you have to think about this very, very realistically. You can't think about this in a sort of optimistic, idealist, this is all going to work out kind of sense, because that's how people crash and burn. You need to think about, what are the odds of my actually finding a position that is going to use this degree? Because you have to earn a living unless you're independently wealthy. If you have a trust fund, then it's a whole different question, right? But if you don't, like the rest of us, then you've got to be very, prudent about these matters. Daduta, thoughts on Oswald Spengler? Haven't read him for a long, long time. He's got that whole decline of the West idea, and that's pretty much it. So maybe I'll go back to him sometime. I don't know. All right. Made of Clay, maybe you've answered this question before, but is Jordan Peterson's take on postmodernism as a whole somewhat accurate? Though I know he generalizes it greatly, yet people seem to believe him. Well, people believe all sorts of bullshit out there, don't they? So who cares if people seem to believe him? People believe all sorts of crazy stuff. That's not a criterion. That by itself, of course, doesn't mean that he's wrong, but you don't use it as a criterion for him being right. Peterson doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to postmodernism, unfortunately. He's using the term in a very sloppy, broad sense. I'll put it to you this way. Either he does know better, in which case he is deliberately misleading people, or he doesn't know better, in which case he shouldn't talk about it. And he's not unique. There's many, many other people who are doing that as well. Or talking about deconstruction, or think that somehow Derrida managed to infect the culture. It's just terrible history of ideas, unfortunately. So, yeah, and that's really all I need to say. I've said plenty about Peterson in the past. All right. Let's see here. More stuff back and forth. Jake Ramsey, can better philosophy substitute the work of psychology, or in what ways do these disciplines cooperate or intersect with regards to helping people? Psychology is not a unified field. So that right there is you can't really ask about psychology as such. If you're talking about psychotherapy, right, or counseling psychology, or whatever we're going to frame it as, can philosophy substitute for that? For some people, yes. For some other people, no. If somebody is really diagnosed with severe depression and needs medication, doesn't matter how many things you have them read and how long you discuss applying Stoic principles or Aristotelian teleology or existentialist philosophy, you're not going to get them to feel better. But it can be very, very helpful in many other circumstances, right? Or if somebody's psychotic, that's not for the realm of philosophy, and it's not even for the realm of most psychologists, right? I would say that good psychologists understand that psychology came out of philosophy, and they do their best to try to incorporate insights from philosophy into psychology. And if you know the history of psychology, you know that is in fact the case, right? Not just in terms of psychotherapeutic approaches, but even experimental psychology or more theoretical things. Very often they can work together, but then you have to be able to do this interdisciplinary work, and most people are not that good at that. But yeah, it can be quite helpful. All right, Neela Nanny, could you please give me any advice about studying philosophy? I'm an English major, want to continue my studies in philosophy. Also, how to understand it fully. Well, I mean, the last one, expect to put in a lot of time and expect it to be an iterative process. I can't even say that I understand all the people that I teach fully, but I don't need to, right? So don't try to hold yourself to an impossible to meet standard. Studying philosophy, there's no substitute for actually reading the primary texts, and that has to be the thing that you go back to over and over again. You can use resources ranging from videos and podcasts, sort of multimedia things, to popular summaries, to all sorts of other things in between. But you can't study Plato without reading Plato. You can't study Hegel, unfortunately, because Hegel's not a good writer, and it's very difficult to work with, without reading Hegel. There's no way around it. And that's the centerpiece. You're going to expect to go back to it over and over again. And I would say, can I give you any useful advice? Yeah. Don't try to boil the ocean. You don't need to study everybody. You don't need to read every single thing that's available. Find some things that you actually resonate with at the current stage that you're at, and study those and derive some enjoyment from it, and don't put these impossible to meet demands on yourself that will make you feel crappy about the activity that should be a joyous activity and an exciting activity. Take what you can, and if you read Plato and you're like, this stuff is just not resonating with me, that might be that it doesn't resonate with you now. And 10 years from now, you'll read it and have a very different experience. And that's okay. I can tell you from experience myself that I didn't understand probably 3/4 of what I was reading as an undergraduate. And there were a lot of philosophers who I read who I love now, like Aristotle. First couple times I read Aristotle, I was like, oh, this is mind-numbingly boring stuff. Why do I have to read this? Who the hell thought this was good? And now I'm an Aristotle scholar and I teach them all the time. But so it takes a while. So maybe that'll be helpful advice for you. Hopefully. All right, Marco Felice, good to see you. So he says, is there a similarity between the state agencies with multiple facets of one's character? Thinking of a Plato's Republic and the fractured state of the soul. Yeah, so, Plato, I don't think he really meant that the tripartite soul, meaning you've got the craftspeople, or really everybody else, right? Here comes everybody. You've got the craftspeople as the bottom part, and then you've got like the brains, the guardians, the decision makers at the top, the political leaders. Then you've got this military / police / whatever, maybe firefighters, the people who need courage to do their work class. I don't think that's a blueprint for how he thought of society in general, because it doesn't actually map onto some of the other dialogues. And certainly, society is more complicated than that, isn't it? You look at Aristotle. Aristotle is going to distinguish like a whole bunch of different organs and functions of the state. But Plato's tripartite psychology, I think, can be quite useful, and it was used by a lot of later writers. It provides a lot of helpful insights, I would say. Now, the fractured state of the soul, right? So most of us are not well integrated from Plato's perspective, because then the top part, the intellectual, the rational part of the soul should be dominating, telling the middle part, the part that is the energy, the part that's concerned with social status, the part that gets angry, what to do, and that enforces its laws upon the appetites, which otherwise cannot control themselves. I think many of us are, pretty fractured when it comes to that. And there's other ways of understanding the fracturedness of ourselves too. Can we map that onto cultures or societies? Yes, but we got to be kind of careful. It's not as if in most cases we have a psychology of a whole city or state or even corporation where the parts of it represent these different functions and they're divided against each other like that. It's usually more complex. So, but it's good to see you, Marco. Cody, I can't help, but shake the notion that hedonism, being pleasure and the reduction of pain, is the good. I see it in Aristotle and Plato, for instance, in the end of Plato's The Myth of seems to me to be Plato arguing, if we're good in this life, we'll choose the right life to live in the next life to reduce suffering and maximize pleasure. Well, sort of. I mean, it's not just about, maximizing pleasure. It's about actually living a life that's decent and enjoyable because you're able to use your faculties. And so it's not, I mean, you have to have a very reductive reading to read Aristotle or Plato as hedonists. And you have to go against so many things that they actually say in their texts. Aristotle's clear. Pleasure is a good. It's not that good. Right. And he says people who think that it is the good, there's something wrong, right? So I don't know. You'd have to deal with that problem, wouldn't you? Profum or fem Do you like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online? It's okay. I like the fact that it exists. Um, Sort of like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Some of the articles are great. Some of the articles not so great. Useful resource. I'm glad that they organized it. You know. As a tool for teaching help. I mean, um, I sometimes suggest articles to my students, but I find that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is usually written at such a level that the average undergraduate student can't get that much out of it. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is sometimes better in that respect, and they vary in quality, right? Sometimes the IEP article is better research. Sometimes the SEP one is. Um, All right, Daduta, what's the relevance of Spengler today? Spengler's probably my biggest intellectual influence. Well, I don't think he has much relevance today, quite frankly. And I think that, we need to beware of, cultural prophets that had it all figured out and actually look at the situation that we're in. If he's your biggest intellectual influence, you might want to check out lots of other people too. So, yeah. JP Fanboy, have you ever read any Gaston Bachelard? I'm just getting into the poetics of space and digging it. Yeah, I read him a long time ago, but I didn't really get into him, so I didn't keep up with it. Bertrand Wallow is Catholic philosopher. Do you think the Pope should be philosophically sophisticated like Benedict the 16th and John Paul II? I don't describe myself as a Catholic philosopher in the sense of the church is, bankrolling or giving the imprimatur to what I do. I think a lot of people from the outside get mixed up about those sorts of things. I work within the Catholic intellectual tradition, but I work within a lot of other strains as well. I think it's cool when the popes are philosophically sophisticated. I enjoy reading Benedict and John Paul's writings because of that. But the role of philosophy has long been, something pointed out is very important within the tradition. So, do I think that the Pope should be philosophically sophisticated? I mean, ideally, everybody should be philosophically sophisticated, right? So that's good. Ellie, experience by itself is not science. Edmund Husserl, what does this mean to some? I don't know what it means to some. Um, simply reflecting on our experience. So some people think phenomenology is just like documenting our experience. I'm doing a phenomenological, analysis. No, you're just writing down what happened to you. A police report is not a phenomenological description. So there's that part, right? Husserl wanted things to be rigorous. So that's probably what he's going on there. Let's see. Neela Nanny, what do I think of Zizek's ideology? You mean the ideology that Zizek himself espouses? Zizek is a Marxist of sorts. Or do you mean his critique of ideology? Or I think sometimes it's very difficult to figure out what Zizek is saying. That's sometimes a problem. What I do like about Zizek is he's willing to take ideas and run far with them. Andrzej Kolak, opinion on Nietzsche's critique of Socrates' cunning self-deprecation and dialogues used to deceive his interlocutor, so they say all they think. Well, Nietzsche has much more critique of Socrates' irony than that. That's a useful function. He draws them out. I mean, Kierkegaard says the same thing too. This is not something really unique to Nietzsche, right? you want to get people to tell you what they think, try to get them to be their witness for themselves, right? To explain their position. Aristotle, by the way, thought that Socrates, in his irony, was going a little bit too far. He uses it as an example in the Nicomachean Ethics. Kyle, do I think a certain amount of polarization is necessary in discourse? Necessary? No. Inevitable? Yes. And that stems more from, I would say it stems more from our vices than from the virtue that we've managed to cultivate. And it's very easy for a lot of people to think that their what they perceive as their virtue is justifying their polarization or the trenchant position they're taking, when it's really coming out of some sort of vice. Crypto coin, how am I doing? What's the most radical philosophy text that made a big impact on my life? That's a tough one. The most radical philosophy text that made a big impact on my life. Well, I went through these phases, and one of the phases I went through was a Sartrean phase, and he's relying on being and nothingness and his other, sort of novels and stuff like that. And it was very uncompromising about nobody gets to ever excuse anything. We are what we choose to be. And I remember actually making a prospective graduate student for SAU cry, and in an argument with him, and then he went somewhere else. He was from Marquette, and we were talking about poverty, and I was arguing with him about what you could do in terms of fixing it. So, all right, Jake has a nice thing here about the question. Kyle Howie, was La Rochefoucauld rallying against what's now commonly referred to as virtue signaling in his maxims? Maybe. I mean, depends on what we mean by virtue signaling. I think people are kind of vague about that because it's a buzzword. I mean, it's nice to see that both right and left now use it. But, he was going against hypocrisy, right? And why do we need a word like virtue signaling? Why not just say somebody's a hypocrite? Because people need to feel cool. And that's what, calling things by new terms gives you a lot of the time. All right, Riley, what do I think about postmodernism? Do I think it's a good thing so many college students take postmodernism as a default perspective, or is this a conservative boogeyman? It's a conservative boogeyman. There's no one thing called postmodernism. And most of the people talking about postmodernism haven't read any of the literature. They've read the summaries, and usually, it's about how terrible Foucault was or something like that. I'd love if we'd put that term on ice for a while. But then people would find some other one to complain about, like cultural Marxism, right? Or all sorts of other silly stuff. I don't think many college students take postmodernism as a default perspective because they're not that advanced. They're not that complex. They take emotivism in ethics. I think McIntyre is completely correct, but they don't just take emotivism. So do their parents. So do most of their professors. So do most of the people complaining about them as sort of a default cultural perspective. But that's different than postmodernism. So, yeah. And I think most conservatives are actually emotivists when it comes down to it as well. As are most liberals. All right. Let's see. Oh, it's 3:00. I'm going to have to get to filming soon. So let me just grab a couple quick things that I could answer. And I'm not going to do any of the what do you think about this person? What do you think about this person? Ones for that. Here's a good one. This is a great way to bring this to a close, since I was, supposed to be talking about student success. So this is from Dash. What is a good way to shift attitude for introductory courses that they will feel less boring after you have the basic familiarity they offer? So that is a great question. How do you change your attitude towards the introductory course that you're taking? And let's sort of like deepen it. Let's say you've got a professor, and the professor half the time doesn't know what he or she's talking about, and they're kind of a jerk, and they have a boring way of lecturing. And, there's all sorts of times in the class where you're like, man, you could have done this. You had a softball coming to you, you could have knocked it out of the park. And so it's kind of disappointing. I would say realize that nothing is holding you back from studying the things that you want to study. Nothing, if you're introduced to some Plato, there's nothing that says that you can't go on and read more Plato than the instructor is having you read, right? And you won't write about it on the paper that he or she assigns you, but there's nothing keeping you from following up all these different threads. And you don't have to feel that you have to do it with Plato. It might be a thread about, I don't know, Kant, or it might be a thread about Hannah Arendt. But there's nothing preventing you from doing that. You live in a extremely fortunate time in that we have access to vast libraries at our fingertips, even just on our phones, right? So don't take the instructor and what that person is doing, or the boringness of the class, or any of that sort of stuff as the hallmark of or the indication for yourself about what philosophy has to provide you or offer you. Instead, exercise some agency, follow up on your own, and see what you can make of it, because then you're going to have a grounding, and the class doesn't end for you when the semester ends. It continues on and on and on, and eventually you get to the point where your education is the larger context, and the classes are just little nodes in it, and that education will continue long after you leave the university. The other thing I would say is see if you can find some other people in your class that want to be challenged as well, and have coffee with them, or go out for drinks, or have a meal, or hang out with them. Forming friendships, forming relationships with your fellow students is an important part of your schooling. It's something that's what it has to offer you. Otherwise, you could just be doing it at home, reading it at home, and watching somebody lecture, right? And that will provide you with some additional ideas, some sustenance, and maybe it can develop into a genuine friendship, which is one of the greatest joys of human life, right? So that's my advice. Hopefully that can help you shift attitude. Yeah, so that's where I'm going to leave off. We'll do another one of these later this month, but I'll do that on Facebook Live. So you want to check the Facebook page for that. My Patreon supporters know when it's coming up already. Everyone else will find out the day of. And that's pretty much it for me. I have to get back to filming, and then I got to do some grading. So I'm almost done with these classes. I can't wait to be finished with the semester. So, all right. Have a great night or evening or day or morning, wherever you happen to be.